It's a sad week here in Baltimore as we mourn the loss of one of our own and one of our greats, Brooks Robinson. Orioles fans of any age will know that there are some clearly defined glory years of this ball club. And for a lot of you who are watching this, like me, I'm guessing those glory years aren't super familiar to you or top of mind. So today I wanted to go through them a bit as a tribute to Brooks, who was the linchpin of those great years in Charm City, to the point that he'd eventually earned the nickname Mr. Oriole. Born and raised in Little Rock, Arkansas, Brooks was the son of a semi-pro second baseman, Brooks Robinson Sr., who got his son interested in baseball, which at the time was America's #1 professional sport by a good margin. Young Brooks grew up a fan of the St. Louis Cardinals and also quickly took to the game as a player, just like his father had. Funny enough, he actually earned a full ride to the University of Arkansas as a basketball player, but with dreams of going pro in baseball, he turned them down. It was a Little Rock resident and former pro ball player by the name of Lindsey Deal, who had watched Brooks play growing up, that sent a letter to Paul Richards, the manager of the Baltimore Orioles, who helped sell the young third baseman to his future club. "He's no speed demon, but neither is he a truck horse," Deal wrote to Richards, his former teammate. "Brooks has a lot of power, baseball savvy, and is always cool when the chips are down." In 1955, Brooks was just 17 when 3 major league clubs made the trip to Little Rock to try and sign him. They were the New York Yankees, the Cincinnati Redlegs, now the Reds, and of course, the Orioles, who had just received the endorsement of Brooks from Lindsey Deal. All 3 clubs offered Brooks $4,000 to sign, almost $46,000 in 2023 value, and in the end, he chose Baltimore. He did so because it was the club who'd shown the most interest, a credit to scout Art Ehlers, but also because they were a team with the most opportunity for a young player to develop. This was just a year after the team had arrived in Baltimore after a relocation from St. Louis, which probably worked in their favor compared to the more established teams in the running who wouldn't have as much room for upward growth. Brooks spent just a few months in the minors before getting his first call up to the Orioles on September 15, 1957, at the age of 18, where he'd make his debut against the Washington Senators. He had 2 hits and 4 at-bats, including an 8th-inning RBI that helped the team towards a 3-1 victory. That might sound like a storybook start to a future Hall of Fame Major League career, but he'd go 0 for 18 the rest of the season, later having this to say about his difficult first stint in the bigs. "Those American League pictures made me look like just what I was. A young, green, immature 18-year-old who'd been lucky that first day against Washington. He'd spend much of the rest of the 50s developing his skills, and also dealing with a litany of injuries, including ligament damage in his knees, a head wound after being hit by a pitch, and a particularly nasty cut to the arm when he caught it against a hook chasing down a fly ball to a dugout. That last one nearly ended his career due to risk of nerve damage, but he made a full recovery and was back to playing after missing just 25 games. It was over this stretch that he split time between the Major League club, their AAA affiliate, and the Arkansas National Guard for a 6-month stint that would exempt him from being drafted into the military. He dealt with some ups and downs at the plate as he continued to work through swing changes that affected his consistency, but his defensive prowess stood out from day one as something that would make him a future star. Contemporary big names like Yogi Berra of the Yankees commented on the bright future that Brooks had when he'd make big plays against them at the hot corner, something that was on full display when he made 3 spectacular fielding plays in the 8th inning of a game that would turn into a no-hitter for pitcher Hoyt Wilhelm. Brooks called this the one big bright spot in an up-and-down 1958 season. For some, this fielding ability came as quite a surprise considering the figure, or lack thereof, that Brooks cut. He didn't have a typical athletic body, and he was kind of a slump-shouldered, not a real muscular guy, and he didn't appear to have a strong arm, his teammate Chuck Estrada once said. But then watching him play, you found out that none of that mattered because he had great hands, a quick release, and the runner was always out. After play in 1958 and his subsequent National Guard service concluded, Robinson did one final stint in AAA that helped him to figure things out as a hitter. When he returned to the major leagues to close out the 1959 season, manager Paul Richards said that he was the best player in the American League for those 5 weeks. It was Richards himself who previously said that Brooks was, quote, in a class by himself as a defensive third baseman, and upon making that final return to the show, biographer Doug Wilson said that he was, quote, no longer overmatched by big league pitchers. As the calendar turned to 1960, 23-year-old Brooks Robinson was about to turn into a superstar. The 60 season was his first as an everyday player, locking down his spot at third base and debuting at 6th in the batting order. After a hot start at the plate, he ascended to 3rd in the order, hitting .351 in the month of July, including a 5-for-5 outing against the White Sox, in which he hit for the cycle. This was the first year the Orioles were truly in the hunt for an AL pennant, and a big part of that was Brooks' breakout that saw him hit for .294 and 14 homers in 152 games. That, along with his now well-known skills at third base, were what saw him finish 3rd in AL MVP voting, behind just Roger Maris and Mickey Mantle, and earned him his first ever All-Star bid and Gold Glove Award. Even those most bullish on Brooks probably would have been shocked to hear at the time that it would be the first of 18 and 16 consecutive times he'd receive those honors. Again, that was the first of 18 straight All-Star games and 16 straight Gold Glove nods. Pretty solid career this guy would go on to have. It was a start that set the tone for a Hall of Fame career, and certainly the next few dynamite seasons in the early to mid-60s, when sports writer Bob Aldi said, quote, "The young old-timers in the press box are beginning to compare Baltimore's Brooks Robinson with the great third baseman of the past in 1961. A funny quote now that we look back at him as a standard at third base. The next year would see Sports Illustrated declare him, quote, "the best third baseman in the league" when he hit for over 300 for the first time, to go along with 23 home runs, his first time eclipsing the 20 mark. This would lead up to 1964, and what writer Maxwell Cates described as, quote, "perhaps his best season," when he played all but 2 innings of the 163-game season, hitting for a .317 average, 28 home runs, a league-leading 118 RBIs, all of which led to him earning his first and only AL MVP award. A year later, in 1965, second baseman Davey Johnson joined the Orioles, once reflecting upon the trip of realizing that Brooks was a natural-born lefty playing third base to the level that he was. "The first time I ever met Brooks was in my first spring training, in '65, he said. "I noticed that he wrote and ate with his left hand. I thought, my God, the greatest defensive third baseman does that. So I ate and wrote with my left hand for a year. It didn't do me any good, but I had to try." Brooks was very much a member of the national scene by this point, but fully solidified himself in the eyes of the baseball world in 1966. The Orioles had just acquired outfielder Frank Robinson from the Cincinnati Reds in a move for the former NL MVP that they hoped would put them over the top in their continued battles with the Yankees and White Sox for an AL pennant. They proved to be fast friends, with Frank looking back just upon how nice of a guy Brooks was despite how quickly his star was rising at the time. "I've never known anyone in any profession more adored than Brooks," he said. "We'd go on road trips and he'd stop on the street to talk to total strangers. It's amazing that he was that good a player and that nice to everyone he met." Frank's impression of Brooks is confirmed by pretty much anyone who ever interacted with him, including many in the media who got to know him over the years covering the team. When fans of Brooks Robinson asked for his autograph, he complied, while finding out how many kids you have, what your dad does, where you live, how old you are, and if you have a dog, said Baltimore broadcaster Chuck Thompson. His only failing is that when the game ended, if Brooks belonged to its story, and usually he did, you better leave the booth at the end of the 8th inning. By the time the press got to the clubhouse, Brooks was in the parking lot, signing autographs on his way home. Pairing up Frank Robinson and Brooks turned out to be a masterstroke, as Frank slotted third into the batting lineup right in front of Brooks, creating a formidable 1-2 punch. That year, Frank won the AL MVP after taking home the Triple Crown, with Brooks coming in second in the voting, followed up by teammate Boog Powell, who came in third. With all that star power, you won't be shocked to hear that this was in fact the first AL pennant year in team history, as he owes Clinks the honor on September 15th. In Game 1 of the '66 World Series, Frank and Brooks hit back-to-back homers off Dodgers picker Frank Drysdale, 2 decisive shots that helped Baltimore towards a 5-2 victory in a tone-setting performance. Drysdale's second pitch to me was a high fastball, and I parked it in almost the same seats in the left field pavilion that Frank had hit his to, Brooks said after the game. The Orioles would go on to win the series in a 4-game sweep, with Brooks making a critical reaching play on a ground ball that led to a double play, leading to a 1-0 Game 4 victory. Maybe the most iconic photo in Orioles history came from this game, as Brooks is pictured leaping in the air as he rushes towards pitcher Dave McNally in celebration of winning the game and becoming World Series champions at long last. Brooks' stellar play would continue for the next few years to the point that his selection to the All-Star Game and awarding of a Gold Glove became an annual tradition. In 1969, the Orioles would win the newly formed American League East Division for the first time. A 4-hit game by Brooks in that year's ALCS sent the Orioles to the World Series again. They faced off against the New York Mets, with Robinson having a potential hit in Game 4 that could have driven in multiple runs robbed of him by Ron Swoboda in a game that Doug Wilson said, quote, "is one of the all-time great plays in World Series history." Baltimore would lose the series in 5 games, as another decade came to a close. A new decade and his 15th year in the pros might have been an understandable time for Brooks Robinson to start slowing down as a player, but of course he did anything but that. Returning again to the ALCS in '70, Robinson batted for an astounding .583 against the Twins, driving in 2 runs and scoring 3 of his own in a 4-game sweep that gave Baltimore their 3rd AL pennant in 5 years. They'd face off against Frank Robinson's former squad in the Cincinnati Reds, in the early days of what would become known as the Big Red Machine. They'd dominate the NL over the course of the next decade, but the biggest and baddest machine out of anyone in the 1970 World Series was none other than Brooks Robinson, who batted for .429 with 2 home runs and put on a defensive showcase that to this day is the stuff of legend for our true seamheads out there. In Game 1, he threw out Lee May at first on a 180-degree turned one-hopper after backhanding a hardliner his way in a play that ESPN's Jason Sark would rank as the 3rd greatest play of all time. Go figure that in the 7th inning, he'd hit a solo homer that would prove the difference in a 4-3 win. He'd continue these athletic theatrics in Game 2 as he made all sorts of different plays on the ball to throw out the likes of Lee May, Bobby Tolan, and Pete Rose when they were sure they'd reach base safely, with Robinson's heroics helping the O's to a 6-5 victory. He kept this up through the rest of the series, turning nothing into something off of the otherwise hot bats of players like Tony Perez, Tommy Helms, and Johnny Bench. All told, Baltimore would win the series 4-1, with Robinson starting 2 double plays from the hot corner and cleanly fielding 23 chances that he'd convert into outs. With television becoming more of a ubiquitous phenomenon, Brooks truly announced himself to the country at large on the Orioles' second World Series run, earning him the nickname the Human Vacuum Cleaner for his penchant to hoover up the ball seemingly out of nowhere and make a play on it. Perhaps nobody was made more aware of his greatness than the team he just taken out to the cleaners for the past 5 games. "I've never seen anything like what he did to us in that series," Reds manager Sparky Anderson said. "He killed us. I'm beginning to see Brooks in my sleep. If I dropped this paper plate, he'd pick it up on a one-hop and throw me out at first. I've never seen anything like him in my life," Pete Rose said. "He has to be the greatest third baseman of all time," said Tony Perez, who also played third. "I just enjoy watching him play. He's in the right place every time." "I made Brooks the MVP of that World Series," said Johnny Bench. "I hit 14 rockets at him and he caught every one of them. The next time I saw him was the 1971 All-Star Game in Detroit. My second at bat, I hit a BB at him and he just scooped it up like it was nothing. I threw my hands up in the air as I ran to first base. I looked at him. He just laughed." In 1971, Brooks signed a new $100,000 contract with the Orioles, making him one of only a dozen players in the 6-figure stratosphere at the time. It would of course prove to be worth it, as he'd go on to play 50 games in a row without committing an error, and make it to the AL All-Star Game as its top vote-getter for the 71 season. Funny enough, that streak would be broken as Brooks would commit 3 errors in a July 28th matchup, with biographer Doug Wilson writing, "Men had literally walked on the moon before Brooks Robinson had made 3 errors in a game," referring to the '69 moon landing. The O's would take the 71 AL pennant yet again, for their 3rd year in a row and 3rd total under manager Earl Weaver. They'd lose the World Series in 7 games to the Pittsburgh Pirates, with Robinson still contributing a hell of an effort, batting for .318 and driving in a series-leading 5 runs. As strong as Brooks' play on the field was, he was equally impressive off of it. As the Orioles player representative, he voted in favor of striking in 1972 in order to obtain more employee leverage in the form of an arbitration period and a $500,000 increase in player pension funds. "I want to play," he told reporters at the time. "All players do. It all boils down to whether the owners are willing to make some concessions. I think our fellows are willing to make some too. And that seems to be the best chance." The strike only lasted 10 games, but Brooks was actually booed in his first at-bat at Memorial Stadium in '71. No doubt a difficult moment for a guy who'd done so much to endear himself to Baltimore. As his numbers declined a bit after the 1972 season, he also wound up having to defend himself from remarks made by his own team's manager, as Earl Weaver suggested that he and some of the Orioles vets were getting too old to continue to play effectively. "I find the remark embarrassing," Brooks said. "I don't enjoy going places to hear people say I'm over the hill or know that they're thinking it." The two would make amends, with Brooks stating Earl was a great manager, and that he'd rarely questioned him over the years. Despite his down numbers, Robinson still took home the '72 Commissioner's Award, given to the player who best represented himself as a player and a person, a fitting award to a guy like Brooks, and a nice piece of lifetime achievement as his career was winding down. Despite Brooks' slightly declining numbers and ability in the field, the Orioles would still advance to the ALCS in 1973 and '74, though they lost to the Oakland Athletics both times. The true sign that he was on the downturn came in 1975, when issues with injuries coupled with his declining abilities led to Brooks missing his first All-Star game since 1960. The next year, 1976, was the beginning of the end for Brooks, as Earl Weaver decided to replace him as the starter at third, with young prospect Doug DeCinces. Robinson requested a trade to see if he could continue as an everyday player elsewhere, but after scuttling a move to the White Sox over a contractual disagreement, he opted to remain in Baltimore. 1977 would be Brooks' final season as a pro, with his last big moment in an Orioles uniform being a 10th-inning walk-off home run against the Indians at Memorial Stadium. The rest of the year was a bit of a wash, as the aging Robinson was mainly relegated to the bench. By late August, a recovering Rick Dempsey was set to return from the disabled list, and with the Orioles needing a roster spot, Brooks opted to retire on the spot, leading to a standing ovation at Minnesota's Metropolitan Stadium later that day. A month later, Brooks was honored at Memorial Stadium in a home game that drew an attendance of 51,978. The largest number in Orioles history up to that point. All told, Brooks Robinson ended his career with 2,848 hits, a .267 average, 268 home runs, and 1,357 runs batted in. In 39 postseason games, he batted for .303 with 5 home runs and 22 runs driven in. Defensively, he led the AL in fielding percentage for a record 11 seasons. He also holds the third baseman's record for most games played at the position with 2,870, most putouts with 2,697, most assists with 6,205, most total chances with 9,165, and most double plays with 618. In 1977, just after he'd retired, the Orioles made Brooks Robinson and Frank Robinson the inaugural inductees of the team's Hall of Fame, with the club officially retiring his number 5 on April 14, 1978. 5 years later, he'd make the Baseball Hall of Fame as a first ballot selection in 1983. just one of 16 players at the time who'd received that distinct honor. 3 statues of Brooks stand around Baltimore, with the most prominent one being on display at Oriole Park at Camden Yards, having been unveiled on September 29, 2012. Even after retirement, he remained with the organization as a color analyst, calling as many as 60-plus televised games a year for a few decades, as he and his family remained in the area, settling in Owings Mills. He spent much of his life still in the area since, and still avidly following the Orioles, right up until he passed away just a few days ago. He recently met with the team's young core and told them how much he appreciated them and what they were doing meant to him as a fan of the club. While guys like Adley Rutschman, Gunnar Henderson, or Grayson Rodriguez may hope to match Brooks' playing career, it'll be tough for them to measure up to him in totality when it comes down to the impact on Baltimore at large. And that's nothing against them. If this quote from Oriole historian Ted Patterson is any indication, it isn't exactly a fair comparison for anyone who's represented the organization, or will moving forward. Other stars had fans, Patterson wrote. Robbie made friends. Never has a player meant more to a franchise and more to a city than Brooks has meant to the Orioles and the city of Baltimore.